Sydney Caitlin West was born on July 11th, 2001 in Walnut Creek, California, to Kimberly and Jason West. Her parents were over the moon with the new addition to their family, and like many parents all over the world, they thought that their daughter was simply a star. Sydney, or Sid as she liked to go by, proved quickly that she was indeed very special. While attending Foothill High School, Sid became one of the star players of the varsity volleyball team, and then she went on to become the co-captain. Just knowing that, it's easy to say that Sid was great at sports, something she proved even more when she rose up the ranks to become one of the leaders of her team. This is something that would have been a huge achievement all on its own, but sports weren't the only thing that Sid thrived in. She also had a big love and huge talent for music. She wrote, recorded, and performed her own songs all the time, and a lot of her music is still out on social media platforms for everyone to see and listen to. But in 2017, things could have gotten a little shaky for Sid and her family. They moved to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Sydney had to change high schools. She had to leave her volleyball team and everything else she knew behind, but Sid rose above all of those changes. She graduated from Carborough High School with plans to go to university, but first she wanted to take a year off to get some life experiences under her belt before she committed to getting a degree. She kept up with her sports and her music, and then she got into UC Berkeley and moved back to California. Things went well for her there, but like so many people around the world, 2020 hit Sid hard. First, she got a concussion during an accident whilst working out, and then, with all of the restrictions due to the pandemic, her classes were moved online. This was a turning point for Sid. She struggled to keep up with her lessons, both because of her injury and because lockdowns had forced this usually very active and outdoorsy young woman inside and away from her family and her friends. She tried her best to keep up with everything, but living alone in her dorm and dealing with everything by herself became too much, and subsequently Sydney took the fall semester off to try and focus on her health. The idea and the hope was that she would have recovered from her concussion by the time the spring semester came around, and that the restrictions would have been lifted so that she could physically go back to classes again. But in a time when Sydney may have needed an extra pair of hands around her, that's not what she got. As previously mentioned, Sydney stayed in California, living alone in her dorm room and cut off from most of her friends. She did keep in regular contact with her family back in North Carolina, but it's easy to miss things when people only keep in contact over the phone and don't actually see each other physically in person. That being said, as the year went on, the restrictions lifted enough that people were allowed back outside to exercise, and Sid made sure that she was doing her best to get herself back on track, both physically and mentally. On September 29th, 2020, Sydney also had a long phone call with her father, catching up on everything and making sure he was kept in the loop about how she was feeling and what was going on in her life. And then the two of them made plans to call each other again the very next day. The next morning, Sid used a rideshare service to get to the Golden Gate Bridge, and this was a place that Sydney knew really well. She often spent time at the Golden Gate Bridge because she liked to take walks and jogs across the bridge, and she also liked to take pictures and do yoga at the nearby Chrissy Field. But this particular trip to the bridge would play out a lot differently to the ones she'd taken before. At 6:45 a.m. that morning, cameras at the entrance of the bridge spotted Sydney wearing dark leggings, a blue hoodie and a pair of Vans with a tropical floral pattern on them, and she was also spotted with a backpack on her back. In the footage, Sydney walks into the entrance to the bridge, and that was it. Later that day, her father, Jason West, tried several times to get in contact with his daughter, but she never answered the phone. Jason, understandably, must have been extremely worried, but when a young woman isn't answering her phone when her father calls, it's not exactly that unusual, and Jason let things be. He may have even been hopeful that Sid was keeping herself busy and hadn't even noticed that he'd called in, but when he couldn't get through to her the next day, Jason called the police. He actually managed to file a missing persons report both in North Carolina and in San Francisco, so there were two sets of investigators looking for Sydney, but what they would find would only raise further questions instead of leading them to any answers. The investigators found the footage of Sid entering the Golden Gate Bridge, but that was all. That morning, the bridge had been surrounded by a thick fog, and none of the other cameras in and around the area had captured where Sydney went afterwards. No one else had seen her coming or going, and so, for the rest of the world, it looked like Sydney had just vanished into thin air. A few days after the missing persons report was filed, someone found and handed Sydney's backpack into the authorities. Her phone wasn't inside, and her laptop was later discovered to be at a friend's apartment where Sydney had previously left it, and yet again, the trail went cold. Looking for any clues, the investigators kept an eye on her bank accounts and her social media platforms, but the last activity on either of them went through on the 30th of September. With the little information that they do have, the police don't suspect that Sydney was the victim of foul play, and citing her history of anxiety and her difficulties with dealing with the conditions of COVID lockdowns, the police classified Sydney as someone who was at risk. They believed that if anything has happened to her, it's far more likely that she was the one to do it to herself, rather than there be someone else involved. But whatever really happened to her, Sydney was only 19 years old when she vanished without a trace, leaving behind family and friends who are still desperately searching for answers. No clues about her fate have ever been found to this day, to say one way or another, and in a case like this, it's no surprise that her family have continued to hold onto the hope that one day Sid will be found alive, or she'll reach out to them and tell them that she's okay. Her family have put together a $25,000 reward for anyone who can provide information that leads to either Sydney's location or can tell them or the investigators something that can lead them to Sydney themselves. People wanting to keep track of her case can visit the website her family runs, where they post more information about Sid and where they have made a home for some of her music and her performances. Several tip lines are also available, both where people can leave tips and their contact information, or others where they can just leave a tip and keep their identities hidden at findsydneywest.com. Of course, the hope and the dream for any case like this, that the missing person will be found alive and well, but with us recently starting 2023, that brings us closer to Sydney being missing for 3 whole years. We'd like to encourage anyone who knows anything, small or large, to come forward so that Sid's family can finally get the answers that they deserve and their daughter can come home. Maybe to lead another volleyball team or to record another song. Either way, if Sydney were to come home, she'd find a family who loves her and have continued to love her even when they didn't know where she is. And she would find plenty of people who miss her and would be far happier knowing she's alive and well than they would be angry that she hasn't reached out before.